Sigmund Freud, so the founder of psychoanalysis. There's some really significant things that he wrote about, interpretation of dreams, pleasure principle, the Oedipus complex, defense mechanisms, which we still use and talk about. I'm sure there are hundreds of dissertations that critique and break down problems with Freudian psychology. It's not really, I don't want to say used anymore, but it's definitely important where it led us, right, into a broader look at psychology. What I like to start with is just looking at one of the key things that he broke down in terms of our consciousness is this relationship between the ego, id, and superego, which I think is a really interesting relationship between the ego as being the consciousness, the you, the individual. The id is based on you, the individual, but influenced by things of the world, pleasure, things like instinct, impulse, libido, all of these things that will influence your consciousness, influence your behavior. And then this third thing, the superego, is based on how we are controlled by this superego. That's where the culture lives. That's where cultural rules, that's in our unconscious, that says there's certain etiquette. You're allowed to do this. You're not allowed to do this. You're allowed to wear that. You're not allowed to listen to that kind of music, right? So these kinds of things, it becomes your inner critic that basically is dominating, controlling, conflicting with impulses and conflicting with your own self, your own consciousness. This is also where things like fantasies come in, right? So these are just a couple of a breakdown. Now, the reason I like to start with this is because it's a very broad, very significant development in looking at psychoanalysis. There's many places where Freud went astray, and a lot of people will critique that. But one of the things that I like to use Freud as a huge influence on this transition from 1919 was the Spanish flu, right? That was the pandemic 100 years ago, killed a lot of people. And then all of a sudden there was people repairing from pandemic, huge war, and then there was this tremendous financial growth that was, among other things, the Weimar Republic and just a lot of huge discrepancies of wealthy and poor. Right? And that eventually, in the end of the 1920s, led to the Great Depression, right? The financial crash, 1929. So the point is that I like to present that landscape of history between the two wars is when there was a lot of healing happening, right? Sort of mental healing, emotional healing. But there's this other part of it that influenced the Surrealists. The Surrealists were basically saying, listen, the world is so crazy out there. There's so much crazy stuff going on. I'm not going to look out at the world. I got enough crazy stuff going on in here, really interesting stuff in my own head. I'm going to paint that. That's what I'm going to make art with. So this is one bridge to psychology that I think is really interesting because, well, this is another significant part of this. Artists were interested in this idea of the dream world as a stage, right? The stage where there would be fantastic things that could happen, right? Because you were inventing these worlds almost like you can't control your dreams, right? What pops out in your dreams, but you can see it as if it's happening on a real stage. That was one school, so this idea of the stage. And the other school of Surrealists were people that were more interested in the probability and chance and accidental occurrences that could happen that sometimes carried significance. So one of the very, very common things was a game called the Exquisite Corpse, where you would do a drawing and then you would hand the drawing on to someone else. They wouldn't see what you did, but they would continue on with a few little bit of lines and then do another drawing and then hand it on to another person. So it was also giving the artist's hand away, sharing it with multiple people. These exquisite corpses can be almost tied to thoughts of the Frankenstein monster, right? Sort of piecing together body parts to create a whole. Something else that some of the surrealists in this area of chance and probability, they were poets, they were interested in sort of cutting up a newspaper, and all the words they would pull out one at a time randomly, and then create poetry or prose based on completely random words that popped out. Max Ernst, he is well known for doing these, basically it's a rubbing where you would take a piece of paper and lay it on a floor that was a worn out floor, and you would rub charcoal on it, and these images would appear, right, because after you rubbed it, and sometimes finding these mysterious images that were, you didn't know that they were there, but all of a sudden they appeared, like birds, among other things. So those are just a few examples of what some of the two areas of surrealists were doing. Both of them were based on or influenced by Freudian psychology, some of them in Jungian psychology, which I'm not going to talk too much about. But this also led to people thinking a little bit, questioning images, and perception, which is something that I want to talk about a little bit in the context of how psychology relates to art. The name of this painting is The Treachery of Images. This is not a pipe. So you walk in, you see this lovely painting of a pipe, and you think, oh, lovely painting of a pipe. And then you realize, oh, right, that's not a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. So it's a painting. It's not a pipe. And this sort of flippers classic examples. We have the next two, False Mirror, and then The Lovers in Paris. So this is another example of René Magritte, who did this. Also questioning this reflection, looking out, looking in, inward looking, outward looking, which was very, very grounded in this relationship to psychology, looking inside, or the dreams are. What was picked up by many of the surrealists were sexual repression and different relationships and conflicts. This is probably the one that most of you are familiar with, Salvador Dali. This is leaning a little bit more towards this idea of the stage of surrealism, where dreamlike, where you can imagine melting clocks and these weird sort of noses and lots of ants and scorpions and other things that created this unreal, surreal fantasy world. So most people know this type of work from Salvador Dali. He was also a filmmaker, and he made this one black and white silent film with Louis Buñuel, and it's called La Chienne Andalou. And it was very much, the whole storyline was about sexual repression, about this sexual desire of this man chasing this woman. Here you see he's trying to get her. She slams the door in his hand, and if you can see, if you look closely at what's happening with the hand, you see all of these sort of insects or ants climbing out. Now this is years before CGI, really just a bunch of edits and simple things. But if you can imagine, this is what, 25 years after the first film was ever shown in a theater. This is still very cutting edge stuff. But in this one scene, you see this guy that's been pursuing her. You see this image of the clouds crossing the sky and the moon, and then you see his hand slide across her eye and slice her eye. But he's not actually slicing her eye. He went to a butcher and found some animal and slices the eye of probably a cow or something. But it's just this funny old editing, splicing, and more than anything else, it was this presenting this world largely because of people like Freud. So other examples of other artists like Merritt Oppenheim, right? You're invited for an afternoon tea, and this is what lands on your table. That would be a little bit difficult to drink out of. Sort of flipping what is acceptable on its end. Right. But what I wanted to spend the majority of our time talking about was another brand in psychology, which is Gestalt psychology. So Freud was coming from Austria. Gestalt psychology came from Germany. Freud ended up in England. The Gestalt psychologist ended up in New York. So specifically in Rochester, not New York City. But let's talk about this a little bit. So what I'm referencing is Wertheimer. So there's a couple of things that, like, the really simple way to summarize Gestalt psychology is this saying, the whole is greater than the sum of all of its parts, right? The whole is much more significant than the sum of all of the individual parts, right? So that's the core of all of this. So it has a lot to do with perceptions. This is this sort of classic example of one of the methods. There are 7 key principles of Gestalt psychology. One of them has to do with this negative positive flip-flop. I'm going to speak about this primarily in the context of design, right, and art, visual perception, but this also flows into, Gestalt psychology flows into other areas of, for example, education. When I say design, I'm talking about things like graphic design, fashion design, interior design, product design. It's still used. Perception plays on our perception of what we see. Do we see it as a vase, or do we see it as 2 faces coming nose to nose? The study of perception emphasizes that the whole of anything is greater than its parts, right? So there is more significance to looking at a whole thing, which is contrary to what a lot of structuralist theory was more about, breaking things down into parts to understand the individual aspects of things to then put it back together, right? So that was immediately a conflict. Just to give you a sense of what Gestalt means, the word in German Gestalt can be translated as shape or form. It's true, but it's not exactly helping to define what it is. For us, in terms of design, it translates everything the eye sees into a unified whole, referring to how visual input is perceived by human beings. So basically, it has a lot to do with this idea of what we see, what the whole of what we see, as opposed to we don't see things in little parts. We see things in broader strokes, not small details. The word can be associated with design. This is where it's used a little bit more commonly. Like, for example, I said Gestalten or Gestaltung is often used in relationship to design, the way things are placed or put together. This is also used in psychology in a similar method where you would talk about things like patterns, right? That's something, a term that would come up in psychology more often, or configuration of things. So I just think this is important to share because the word itself is not very easily translatable. This is a broad translation of Gestalt. So what I wanted to talk about for today were these 7 Gestalt principles. So proximity, similarity, closure is one that I like a lot. We talked about figure ground already, continuity. There are so many great examples. I just have a small sampling. It's a visual thing. That's what makes it fun, that there are so many examples. So this is another example of figure ground. It does this flip-flop similar to the vase, which is which? Do you see the white as the background and the small box as the figure? Or do you see this as a whole, like making a donut? Or is this an object? This is an interesting design tool that's used, is this ability to use many aspects of one image to do a lot of different things. And the law of symmetries, which, again, part of it is there's what we know, and do you ever question what you know in terms of how things are arranged? So we know that these brackets are central and something would be in between them. So we don't perceive these two together, even though they're closer in proximity. It's the symmetry of these two that makes us connect those, even though these are more closely connected. Similar is what happens when you have a grouping of brackets. Still, even though these are mirror image, literally, this could be a butterfly, we still connect these two before we're going to connect these two. This is something that is, to me, fascinating about our perception, what we see and how we organize things. And that's really what this comes down to in design, how the brain works in terms of perceptions and how we organize things, how we arrange things, how we find pleasure, how we find harmony in similarities and tendencies towards things. So what do you see? What else do you see besides dots? We could see it as individual parts, or we could might see it first as a triangle. What's connecting, our brain is connecting them. A simpler way to show that in this concept of closure. Our brain wants to close. There's not a circle here, right? Because it's just a bunch of dashes. There's not a square here. It's just a bunch of corners and everything. You know when your computer is loading and sometimes you get this circle-y thing and it's not actually a circle? It's like a C. That's one of those good examples of closure, which is really interesting for designers of all kinds, is when you can not do something, but still you're getting the full whole done. People refer to it as the economy of form, reducing the form to the simplest amount, but you're still going to get the maximum impact, right, through that kind of economy. Because our brain wants to connect those dashes and make it into a circle. Here's another example of that. This is a different one, which is called proximity. So even though we have a grouping of circles here, we also have a grouping of circles here, but based on the proximity to them, our brain is connecting these as a group, these as a group, and these as a group, as opposed to this as a large group of circles. Because of the proximity, we are connecting them. That relates to this idea of similarity. This is something that I think is also really fascinating in our tendency to summarize, to group things together, to associate similarities, to make assumptions, to have biases based on things are similar. They have to be the same, right? We're not seeing individual circles here because there's a similarity to them. So it's just another example of how we group things through this idea of the common regions. We, just by putting frames, literally, that's what we do in art, we frame things. How you frame something. I like the way that these terms are used in idioms. This idea of having a frame around something, or framing something, or seeing something within a specific frame is containing it, limiting it, summarizing it in many ways. And it's not just examples here about a bunch of circles and squares and red dots and black dots, but how these concepts carry into the way that we see things in the world, the way we behave, the way we summarize things or make assumptions about things or have biases for things. We have a tendency to want harmony. We want things to match. We want things to work together. We want things to come in to some level of stasis. So by having just simply these three that happen to be parallel are going to lend us to appreciating those and thinking the other ones are out of place. Right? So even though they're all exactly the same, three of them are different than the three that are similar and more parallel and more organized and more structured and more acceptable. You think about how this language can be attached to other aspects of how we perceive things. Okay, this law of Pragnantz is just the simplicity of form, that we have a tendency, before we're going to break this down into looking at parts, we want to see the whole. One of the examples that's often used with this is the Olympic circles, right? The classic Olympic symbol, where we see those as connected. We don't see those as individual circles. Individual circles also that are not complete. They're all interwoven, which leads a little bit to the next one, which is this idea of continuity. We'll see this object, this key, and we're perceiving there to be a second key that's behind it, right? But really, that's not the reality of what's happening. The reality, this is just a circle with a line, then it stops, and then this starts up with this other weird shape that's up there, but they're connected. There's this continuity that bring them together, that make us see them as one whole, as one continuous part that connects them, that binds them. This, by the way, is something that magicians use quite a lot. When they put something behind their hand and it looks like it's one string, but it's actually two, but it looks like it's one because you're not seeing what's in between. This idea of continuity is something that's often used. The reason I like this is because it's a need, a sort of desire to complete. That's what this is. We want to see the whole before we want to consider its parts. That's really the gist of this whole idea of Gestalt psychology, what it does. So this is the fun part in the context of this class of art and science, is because there is always this desire in science for something to be concrete, to be measurable, to be repeatable. This is one of the problems that does occur with psychology, is there's nothing concrete. So one of the things about Gestalt psychology, while we might all collectively, subjectively be in agreement, yeah, that's true. Those brackets look like this. They don't look like that because of the proximity. That makes sense. But that's not something that is measurable and provable other than statistics. If you are a design student or like fashion design, anything that deals with design, some aspect of this will be discussed, will be used, because it has to do with how we see things, how we find harmonies, how we find pleasure in certain things, how we organize things, how we arrange things. So that's ultimately where I see there to be an interesting conflict between what is art and science, what is perception and what we recognize versus what is concrete and measurable.